Test.
We're good to go?
Thanks.
Welcome to ETSU Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds. Dr. Musil will be talking to us today. Dr. Musil is board certified in general pediatrics, child and adolescent psychiatry, and adult psychiatry. He's trained at Vanderbilt University, Quillen College of Medicine, Dallas Theological Seminary, and University of Kentucky. He finished his fellowship in 1997 and primarily practices child psychiatry at Frontier Health. He specializes in ADHD, mood disorders, and autistic spectrum disorders. He'll be talking to us today about DMDD. Dr. Musil.
Welcome. Hopefully everybody got a handout, and I'm going to attempt to stand behind here, but if you know me, we'll see how long I make it. Usually I'll end up wandering. You can hear me okay? Okay. So you have the slides, those you have, and then you have 3 handouts, and I'll allude to the slides as we go forward. We're here to talk about a new diagnosis. And you can see that. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. This is brand new to the DSM-V. It did not exist in the DSM-IV. That means it's been around since May of 2013, and it's just sort of becoming of age. I don't know that I've ever given a more boring presentation. We're actually going to look at the criteria from the DSM-V, and my entire life of speaking, I've done everything I could to try and avoid that. So you'll see some interesting slides along the way to kind of wake you up. Let's talk about objectives. I'd like for you to be able to walk out of here with knowing at least 3 of the 11 criteria. 3 of the 11 criteria, I'd like you to be able to compare and contrast DMDD with child bipolar disorder, which are the exact same criteria as adult bipolar disorder. Don't change the criteria for children in the DSM-V. And then take a whack at treatment. And the reason I say whack at is that there are no evidence placebo-controlled trials when it comes to DMDD. All right, now they're probably on the way, but you're going to have to do some fudging when it comes to treatment. And I've provided 1 2-page handout for you about treatment. Okay, I have nothing to disclose. They request that I give a clinical question or something that you'll feel more comfortable answering in 45 minutes from now. And actually, this is only about a 30-minute presentation. But in about 30 minutes, I would like for you to feel more comfortable giving a true or false answer to this. And hopefully you'll get it right. So I'll read it to you. Children or adolescents diagnosed with DMDD, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, have less dysfunction and have a better prognosis than children diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Okay, so I hope right now you're kind of scratching your head as to the answer. But in 30 minutes, I hope you feel pretty comfortable answering that question. Okay, I have a, not a Snickers bar, but a candy bar for anyone that can fill in the blank. So the reason I'm doing this presentation, the reason that this is brand new in the DSM-V, the reason it didn't exist in the DSM-IV is because of the one word that I'm going to ask somebody in the audience to blurt out. It's the same word for all 3 blanks. And it's the reason that this is such a complex issue. So I'll walk you through this. What do we do when it comes to diagnosis and treatment with a chronically blank kid, with a dysfunctionally blank kid, so blank they can't even be safe? Who's got the word? It's worth it. Not angry, but you're really close. Irritable, right there. So give you some history on that. The DSM-III, so I'm told, and I actually this morning tried to get into the Google and actually find the DSM-III, which I've never actually seen. I graduated with the DSM-IV-TR. I actually have that book in my office, but I don't have the 3, which came out in 1980. I was a freshman in high school. Anyway, supposedly when you looked up ADHD back then, irritability was one of the criteria. When the DSM-III-R came out, they got rid of the criteria for irritability under ADHD. And since then, child psychiatry has not known what to do with chronic irritability. It's been anywhere and everywhere, okay? It's been in bipolar, it's been in depression, and so I'm hoping to take a whack at that issue in the next 30 minutes. Okay, so here you have the problem. The problem is, what do I do with a chronically irritable kid? What I call interview intolerant. Everybody know what that means? They walk in, I introduce myself, I ask them their name, and they tell me to go F myself. Okay? Now that's how they typically present. By the way, an oppositional defiant kid, how do they present in my office? Walk in, they talk to me, they're smiling, and they couldn't be happier. How do mother and I look in the office? Like we both have hemorrhoids. We're in pain. Kid couldn't be happier. Okay, he's exactly where he wants to be. He wants to be a pain in the butt. Okay? All right, so I'm going to walk you through 11 criteria, and I apologize, I'm going to read these to you. You can read them 3 times faster than I can speak them, but I think it's important because we're going to divide this up like a pie in multiple different directions in the subsequent slides. So here goes. And the first 4 criteria are the ones that matter. Severe recurrent temper outbursts manifested verbally or behaviorally that are grossly out of proportion in intensity, duration, or to the situation or provocation. Number 2, or B, the temper outbursts are inconsistent with developmental level. What does that mean? That means if you have a 9-year-old who's developmentally delayed, let's say they're developmentally at the level of a 2-year-old. Well, we all know that everybody goes through sort of through the terrible 2s if they're appropriately developmentally progressing. So you want to take developmental level, not their chronological age, but their developmental level into account when working on this diagnosis. The temper outburst must occur somewhere around 3 times a week. And that's really helpful. Okay, and I'll explain more in a minute. And then D would be probably the most important take home. The mood in between temper outbursts is persistently or chronically irritable or angry most of the day, nearly every day, and is observable by others. So this isn't a kid saying they feel irritable or angry on the inside. You can also look at them and see that they're irritable and angry. Okay? Okay, next criteria, probably less important. I really want you to remember A, B, C, and D. E is A through D have persisted for at least 12 months, never 3 months without symptoms. F, symptoms A through D are present in at least 2 of 3 settings, and they give you some examples. And in one of those settings, they've got to be severe. That's almost always home. G, the diagnosis should not be made before the age of 6 or after the age of 18. There's only one reason for that. There hasn't been enough studies on the validity to do that yet. Okay, so I probably have mostly adult prescribers and psychiatrists and all that in the room. So if you have a 19-year-old that comes to your office and I diagnosed them 2 years ago with developmental disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, I think I said that right, can you hang on to that diagnosis? Can you leave it in your chart or on their chart? Yes, you can. Once they're diagnosed, it can follow them. What you can't do is diagnose somebody over the age of 18 initially. You've got to come up with somewhere else. And that may change over time once we understand this disorder better. H, by history or observation, the age at onset is before the age of 10. What is that really saying? This is a developmental disorder. We do the same thing in ADHD. DSM-IV, it used to be 7, now I believe it's 12 or 13 in the DSM-V for ADHD. There's never been, and this is interesting right here, this has never been a distinct period lasting more than 1 day, 24 hours, during which the full symptom criteria except duration for a manic or hypomanic episode has not been met. Now think about what that's saying. That means they can have mania for 23 hours and 59 minutes, and you're not going to diagnose them with bipolar disorder. Okay? Yes? I think we're small enough for questions right now. Huh? Mm-hmm. Not at all. You just have to. That's correct. The best example of that would be adult ADHD. We're allowed to make an adult initial diagnosis as in an adult, but you have to go back and find some symptoms in the history prior to now the age of 12 or 13. The DSM-IV was before the age of 7. So you just have to have some symptoms. If this starts at 17, innate DMDD by definition. Okay, J, the behaviors do not occur exclusively during other symptoms or diagnosis, major depression, and some others. The diagnosis cannot exist with ODD, intermittent explosive, or bipolar disorder, and I'll dive into that in some further slides. Last is kind of the rule out. The symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of the substance or an additional medical or neurological condition. I'll give you an example. I recently saw a 9-year-old who was diagnosed 13 months ago with junior rheumatoid arthritis. And at that point, they were put on methotrexate and steroids. Since then, for the last 13 months, they've been irritable, angry, and a monster, behaviorally. Should I diagnose them with DMDD? No. This is most likely secondary to steroids, methotrexate, and maybe some other family stuff. Okay? Okay, so you're experts. You have read the criteria. You know everything there is to know about DMDD. Okay? The first thing I want to ask is, and I've got another candy bar, what chapter in the DSM-V is DMDD found? There's chapters in the DSM-V. What chapter is this found in? It's a big deal. A little bit louder. Kind of. Get a little bit closer. Depressive disorder. Can I throw it? I'm a terrible... Oh, I'm short. Somebody help me out there. So much for my arm. Okay, so I just want to point out that when you're trying to figure out ODD versus DMDD, the first thing that should pop into your head is this more moody or more behavioral? That helps you separate the two out. Okay, and I think that's an important take-home message when you're practically doing this in your office. Okay, so this is a mood disorder. Okay, diagnostic features. So a lot of this is straight out of the DSM-V. These are the core symptoms. If there's one slide I want you to remember more than anything else, it's this slide. Okay, and let me give you some background as to why I say that. Give me the 3 core criteria of ADHD. If you can remember these 3, you can probably know the criteria for ADHD. Inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. Those are the 3 core criteria for ADHD. So the 2 core criteria for DMDD is temper outburst, and chronic irritability. They're pissed off always. Okay? Everybody okay with that? Again, to me, they're interview intolerant. That's how they present most often in my office. Prevalence rates, somewhere between 2 and 5%. That means if you have a classroom of 25 children, your average teacher has 25 children in their class, they're going to have 1 kid in there that meets this criteria. 2 kids that meet the criteria for ADHD in the average classroom. Males more likely than females. The literature's dancing with this number right now. They're saying 3 to 1. I'm seeing some 2 to 1 in some of the newer stuff, but nobody's hanging they're hanging on to that number yet. Developmental course. I've already said it's developmental before the age of 10. Validity is questionable before and after those ages. At 1 year, about half the kids diagnosed still meet the criteria. Rates of conversion to bipolar, extremely low. That's probably why we did away with diagnosing so many children with bipolar disorder. When you follow kids diagnosed at Woodridge and in my office with child bipolar NOS, that's generally what we diagnosed them with. Most of them did not end up meeting the full adult criteria for bipolar disorder. However, they did meet the criteria for depressive disorder and anxiety disorders. Temperamental, this is straight out of the DSM-V because it's an awkward statement. It's a home for ODD, ADHD, irritable kids. So if you've got an incredibly moody ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD kid, and the mood is probably the biggest issue, you need to be thinking DMDD. The DSM-V says that's appropriate. Okay? Genetically, again, I've already said, related to substance abuse, depression, and anxiety, and they're doing some pretty cool research on facial recognition stuff, and here's an article about that. DMDD, males more than females, bipolar children, male to female equal. Dysfunction, they're terribly dysfunctional. In fact, they're just as dysfunctional and just as likely to be hospitalized as children with bipolar disorder. That's one of your objectives. They're terribly dysfunctional, maybe more dysfunctional than bipolar children. Why? Because they're chronically irritable. Whereas classic bipolar, typically has pretty good function and mood in between episodes. Everybody okay with that? Okay, differential diagnosis is straight out of the DSM-V. Bipolar, ODD, ADHD, and I'll dive into this a little bit more, but really remember that there's exclusion. You cannot diagnose them with DMDD and bipolar. You cannot diagnose them with intermittent and DMDD. Okay, now recently I had a kid that was at residential treatment for 6 months. He was 13, I think, and he came back after 6 months, the final diagnosis was disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, unspecified bipolar, and intermittent explosive disorder. According to the DSM-V, we can't do that. Okay, now you can give them an ADHD and DMDD. I haven't done that so far. To me, that's incorporated into the diagnosis. All right, I have given some DMDD and major depression or depression unspecified, which is more common in children. So you can have some comorbidity, and that's what this slide is all about. In child psychiatry, comorbidity is the rule, not the exclusion. Okay? And so rarely do I give just one diagnosis. Okay? And that's probably because the DSM is written for adults more than anything else. It's probably because children are developing. It's probably because ADHD is probably be careful how I say this, a questionable brain that hasn't quite grown into a diagnosis. Okay? Remember the old term for ADHD was? That's correct. Okay? That didn't sell so well with parents, so we cleaned it up and called it ADHD. Okay, the book on your right has been thrown at me 4 or 5 times in 20 years. Well, it came out in '97. So I've had parents walk in under their arm, sit down, and they toss it on my desk. Okay? It's made my life a living hell. Okay? Dr. Papalos and his wife, they're great researchers up at Harvard. Okay? They are under Dr. Biederman, the department chair up there, and they're known for irritability is king. That's their phrase. Irritability is king. So if you're a chronically irritable kid, they diagnosed you, and this book proves it, that you have bipolar disorder. Okay? And so I've had this book thrown at me over and over and over and over. And it's really been kind of the rage in the child psychiatry literature, back and forth, back and forth. Then Dr. Geller, kind of an old grandmother of child psychiatry, she came out with the Geller criteria, not in the DSM. And she said if they didn't have 6 to 8 hours of euphoria or grandiosity, it couldn't be bipolar disorder. And so there was this huge debate, irritability versus the Geller criteria. And then research started going down the route of, well, we're only going to use lithium in the kids with the Geller criteria. The literature really kind of went screwy for a while. Okay? And people like me in the community, we just didn't quite know what we had to do. What did I actually do? I lied. Why did I lie? Why did I diagnose children with bipolar NOS that I didn't think really had it? There's a very practical answer to that. Sorry? To get the med I wanted. Basically, take care. Okay? And I slept fine, just to let you know. Not that moral. Okay, and then you have people who came out and said, baloney. This is not bipolar. These are tantruming kids. There's no way this is bipolar disorder. And then you have people, Dr. Greenberg, she's a wonderful developmental pediatrician who's just cashed in on the diagnosis. And has written some wonderful books, very practical, wonderful, great stuff. Anyway, I think they're all worth a read, okay? And it just tells you that we don't quite know what to do with chronically irritable kids. Still don't think we do, by the way. Okay, just to bore the fire out of you, I thought I'd throw the DSM-IV criteria up there and tell you what's wrong with them. So this is straight out of the DSM-IV. First thing you should notice is the word irritable. Somewhere up there. You can't do it from here. Irritable. By the way, the word irritable is also in major depression criteria. Okay, so things are getting complex. So this is supposed to last a week, a distinct period. B criteria is if they're irritable, they got to have 4, not just 3. And then they're going to have inflated, decreased need sleeps, pressured speech, flight of ideas, distractibility. Now, I've given grand rounds here before. Oh, by the way, I should tell you I stole this slide. I changed it just a little bit, but I deserve Dr. Tobin, T-O-W-B-I-N, gave a presentation on this disorder in Knoxville a year ago. And essentially, this is a slide that I sort of retyped and changed just a little. So he needs some credit on this one. But he points out that, what if they're always irritable? Could it meet the criteria? And he just points out kind of the problems with the DSM-IV. And I'm not going to dive much into that. And there is a study that kind of shows some of the problems with that. So I gave a grand rounds 2, maybe 3 years ago on this issue right here you see in front of you. And that is, if you take the DSM-IV ADHD criteria and you take the DSM-IV bipolar criteria and you line them up side to side, look what they share. They share irritability, hyper, restless, impulsive, and I'll fluff that out a little bit more in the next 2 slides. So, bipolar, you have psychomotor agitation. Well, that can look a lot like fidgeting, squirming. It can look a lot like you're up out of your seat on the go. All those terms are straight out of the DSM-V. DSM-V. Flight of ideas. Good luck trying to diagnose flight of ideas in a 7-year-old. Good luck. It's next to impossible. I'll give you an example. My daughter turned 13 not too long ago. 9, 12, and 13-year-old girls came over to my home for about 18 hours. Did they have mania? Did they sleep? Where they have flight of ideas? They met all the criteria for mania, but it was appropriate to the situation. Okay? Distractible. That's actually one of the criteria under bipolar disorder. Well, that's the main symptom in ADHD. All right, expressive, pleasurable activity. How many kids with ADHD can play video games for 12 hours straight? The answer is all. Well, that's a pleasurable activity. So do they all have bipolar disorder? So hopefully you're seeing the complexity there. So the DSM-V tried to clean some of this up. Let me get through all these clicks here. Okay, so the DSM-V made some changes to try and help us child psychiatrists out. They added, under A, increased goal-directed activity and energy. So they tried to kind of tighten it up, and then they really did something really interesting. They said the elevated mood, the irritability, has got to be present nearly every day. That means 50% of the day, not just for 1 hour. Okay? And then under B, this is the thing that's helped the most. Represents these 7 symptoms have to be a noticeable change from their baseline. Ah, boy, that really helps. Because now what do I do with chronically irritable children? They can't meet this criteria. Okay, so if somebody's got all the 7 symptoms for 2 years straight, they basically don't have bipolar disorder. Okay? Now, I don't really believe in DMDD more than I do child bipolar disorder. We're trying to figure it out. We don't know what to do with irritable children. So if you give me a hard time over DMDD, I'll agree with you. This is what I have to work with right now in my office. Okay? Last 5 slides, I'll tell you what I'm doing with it. I'll give you my way of handling this issue. Okay, so that means some children diagnosed with bipolar and OS no longer meet the criteria according to the DSM-V. And here's the reasons why. You have them in front of you. Okay? Should we ignore childhood bipolar disorder? Absolutely not. When you talk to somebody who meets the full criteria as an adult and you ask them when their mania started, most, 50%, started before the age of 18. Okay? And so you still see some children come out of my office in Woodridge and other hospitals and offices still diagnosed with bipolar. The risk of suicide, we all know this, and it can take a long time to get diagnosed. Okay, you have a really interesting article, a 1-pager. It's a front and back page by Gabrielle Carson. I think that's who it's by. She was one of the people that was involved in those arguments. So she and Biederman would just hammer it out in the literature and editorials, and they just call each other every name possible, and you're nuts and you're crazy and all that kind of stuff. And she's kind of written a review of how we got to where we are. And I've kind of explained how when they took out the DSM-III irritability clause under ADHD, we just don't know what to do with them. Okay, just a couple of numbers. Look what's happened to adult and child bipolar diagnosis over the years. This is outpatient numbers, by the way. So adult diagnosis has gone up, but look what's happened to child and adolescent numbers outpatient. Wait till you see the next slide. This is inpatient. 438%. Teenagers, 296%. All right, it should tell you we don't know what to do with these kids. And I still don't think we do. Okay, I almost started the presentation with this slide. You guys can tell me at the end if you think I did a good job or not. If you remember, I started the presentation with the problem, and I wanted you to, this young man right here got the candy bar for the word irritable. But I almost started the presentation with this, 2 clinical pictures. You can give me some feedback if you think which way was the better way to start this. So I'm going to read to you, number 1, and then I'm going to read to you number 2. And you tell me if you think they're the same diagnosis or not. An unmedicated teenager boy has 1 week with decreased need for sleep, revelations that he is writing 3 novels at once, writes to colleges saying he should be admitted to teach them his advanced math, has auditory hallucinations in which he hears rumors of the past. That kid ends up with a diagnosis. Is that the same diagnosis as number 2? 10-year-old, angry all the time, argues constantly, aggressive to property, walls, doors, household items. Mom can point all the holes in the walls to tell you about that. Police have been called 3 times in the last year, hits parents, bossy with peers, few friends, fights peers at school, enters on high doses of stimulant, plus 2 atypicals, risperidol and Seroquel, 2 alpha drugs, 10X and clonidine. First mental health came in at 3 after they were kicked out of 3 preschools. See them all the time. They've had a 3-week hospitalization at age 9, and they've been diagnosed with gobbledygook, goulash, everything. Bipolar disorder, mood disorder, NOS, ADHD, probably somebody threw in reactive attachment disorder. They get a little bit of everything. Okay, why? Because we don't know what to do with number 2. So are these the same diagnosis? 10 years ago, they probably would have gotten bipolar 1 and bipolar NOS. The DMDD is trying to separate these out. We'll see what happens. Okay, so I'm still trying to throw the problem at you. And again, I don't think we've solved it. This is stolen from this article. Now, I pulled a fast one on you. In this article, they used the term SND. That's not in the DSM-IV or the 5. That was some criteria that was put out to try and clarify this issue called severe mood dysregulation disorder. It didn't hold, and it was probably the precursor to DMDD. Okay? The problem is, I still see lots of kids in between, the intermediate, the kind of hypomanic. You know, they're at 26 hours or a couple of days, but they're not quite bipolar 1. So it's still really struggling. I mean, you would think this would really help me figure all this out. But kids haven't read the book, and they don't really quite know how to present. Okay, word of caution. Irritability is like sore throat. It shows up everywhere. So does everybody that has a sore throat have strep throat? No, they could be at cheerleading camp, right? Could have a virus. There's lots of reasons for sore throat. Well, irritability is the same way. Most of my ADHD kids are irritable. Most of my ODD kids are irritable. Depression is actually one of the criteria. So please don't diagnose every irritable kid or teenager with DMDD. And this helps clarify that. The last sentence is, however, only a subset of these children will have persistent irritability that is present most days for a year and is required for DMDD. I would say it's developmental. It's been there from the start. Parents can't remember a time the kid wasn't this way. Okay, they were this way when they went to kindergarten, 3rd grade, 6th grade, and on. Okay, gee whiz stuff. In this article, they've actually come up with some hypothesized neurocircuitry for irritability. By the way, question. Is the word irritable a mood or a behavior? It's a trick question. No one is willing to take a stab at it. It's both. We're just not comfortable going there. Okay, now again, this diagnosis ended up in the mood disorders category or depressive episodes. Okay, but if you really want to dive in, there's some thinking as to how you end up irritable. By the way, my view of this is chronic chaos. Most of the kids that I treat, and you've got to remember I work in a community health center, they grow up in pure chaos, where their home life is changing every moment. Okay, and they're basically PTSD kids plus. Okay? Okay, we're going to move. We're doing great on time. So we're going to move over to treatment. Okay? Here's the problem. I don't have one placebo-controlled randomized trial. So I have to fudge. And I'd like to point out that this well-established, you'll see this thing everywhere. Okay? These are the meds in child bipolar disorder. But if you think about it, how many irritable kids were included in these studies that didn't really meet our DSM-V criteria? So you wouldn't expect that lithium would be very effective because this is mixed with DMDD. Okay, and in fact, there is one study out there that says don't use lithium in DMDD. It doesn't work. And my experience is it doesn't help irritable kids. Okay, so I don't want to dive into each drug and all of that. I just want to say that if you see child bipolar drug results, they're questionable now because we've included irritability. Irritability is king. They've been included in those studies. Okay, we still recommend Psychotherapy. And I'm a little bit worried about the word first because we often medicate them if they're moderate or severe. But we still recommend it. But remember, these are very complicated families that have to show up and want to change. Okay? I mostly treat squeaky wheels. What does that mean? It means I have a very messed up family, but the kid is the squeaky wheel. Does the family want to change? No, they want some oil. They want me to oil the child and not change the family. Okay, it's 99% of what I do. And when I start hinting around that the family might need to change, I get fired. All right? All right, the slide down here, who teaches these kids how to slam doors? Parents do. Okay? Okay, this is recently out of a Carlat report. If you're not familiar with it, it's probably the best way to keep up with the literature. Anyway, here are some, these are evidence-based treatments that are non-medication for disruptive behaviors. This is not specific to DMDD. All three of them are wonderful. I'm mostly familiar with Incredible Years. Okay, this is probably what you really want to know. What about medication treatment? I've got two studies up here, and you have a copy of one of them. There's a one-pager front and back up there. The 11 left is up there. But classically, we're going to treat with stimulants, alpha-2s, SSRIs. What's the one the literature says to use? It's actually Celexa, not even FDA approved under the age of 18. Why? It's not activating, and it's not Paxil. We don't use a whole lot of Paxil in kids because of lawyers. Okay, and probably because they're not good about compliance and they have that terrible headache if they miss a dose. Great for compliance, by the way. So Celexa is probably the most prescribed SSRI in this category. Mood stabilizers, I really don't use lithium anymore in DMDD. Use it a lot in bipolar. I do use a lot of trileptal, Lamictal if I feel like the family's safe enough with compliance. Antipsychotics. And boy, we've gotten a bad name for antipsychotics, haven't we? As child psychiatrists. Okay. According to the newspapers, I'm trying to grow breasts in all little boys. Right? Okay, this is what I do in my office. So now I'm giving you Musil. So this is research, this is what's published. Now I'm giving you my opinion. This is what I do in my office. Argue with me all you want, I'll agree with you. Okay? So as I'm taking a history, I'm trying to figure out how scary are they. They kicked the principal between the legs 3 times last week. That's pretty violent. They just yell and call you bad names. That's not very violent. And I put my meds in that hierarchy there. And if you want to argue with me that trileptal's better, I'm fine with that. Again, I'm not really going to hold on to this stuff. So that's one way I go after medicating his children. I also do this. Remember, you can have up to 24 hours of mania and still meet the criteria for DMDD. So I'm kind of asking, how bipolar are they? Meaning, I don't know if I want to add an SSRI. Okay? And so that weighs into. So I kind of take these two things and I cross over and say, oh, I think I'll try trileptal. Or, you know what, let's go with a stimulant. Now, one of the things that has to really come into this is safety. What's scarier? 10X, which is guanfacine, or Intuniv, alpha-2, or risperidol? What's more dangerous? Come on, y'all. Risperidol is 1,000,000 times more dangerous. Okay? So, risperidol might be the most effective for this, but do I really want to jump it 100 miles an hour when 20 miles an hour might do just as good? And so sometimes I got enough time to kind of march my way through different medications, and that's just how I present it to parents. If it were my kid, I'd try 10X out first. But I want you to know, really small chance I'll help you, but very little chance I'll hurt your kid. Risperidol, you'll come back and kiss me, tell me I'm the Pope, tell me I'm the world's greatest doctor. A year from now, when they weigh 50 pounds heavier, you'll tell me I'm not such a good guy. Okay, a little bit more practical stuff, because I don't view this as a very practical presentation. This is what I do in my office. Supposedly in 1 hour, I accomplish this. I document the criteria for DMDD. More importantly, I document the frequency of the tantrums. I can't tell you how important that is. Why? Because after 1 year, the parent will come in and tell me I'm totally ineffective because the kid tantrumed 2 weeks ago one time. When they came in, the kid was hitting the mother 5 times a day, calling her every name, putting holes in the wall. A year later, the kid tantrumed 1 time last month, and they tell me I'm ineffective. So I document the frequency at school and at home, And then when they tell me my meds don't work or that therapy's not working, I go back, I scratch the bald head, I'm kind of dramatic. We go to the psychiatrist. Well, you know, you told me that you were getting suspended 3 times a week. And I point out how things have changed. I can't tell you how important that is. It makes your life much more fun as a child psychiatrist. I document the family chaos, offer treatment options for that. That's tough. That's case management, that's family therapy. Hard to do. Hard to get families invested in that. I set up a safety plan. Do medications create safety? Do medications create safety? Does risperidol, trileptal, lamictal, does lithium create safety? Not at all. And crisis brings me kids all the time that tells me I've got this unsafe kid. What are you going to prescribe that's going to make him safe? And my answer is nothing. I might have something that helps with impulsivity. I might have something that helps with mania. I might help something with pressured speech. But does that always guarantee safety? No. In fact, my SSRIs can push suicide, correct? Okay, a really important concept. So I set up a safety plan. If they're up all night and running out in the street in the middle of the night, what do? High locks and alarms. Okay, I've had parents sleep in the hallway. I've had parents call the fire marshal and nail the window shut. You've got to have the fire marshal involved in that. Next, I develop a hierarchy of target symptoms. Best example of this is depression. Is it appropriate to prescribe Prozac to a depressed person, an adult, when the target symptom is happiness? Not if you want to hate your job. Does Prozac create happiness? Not at all. What does? Happenings. If I win the lottery today, how will I feel? Pretty freaking happy. All right? If my wife calls me and one of my kids has leukemia, how will I feel? That's a terrible happening. Happiness is generally based on happiness. Prozac has little to do with happenings. Now, if you're talking about the criteria of depression, if you're talking about sleep and concentration and all that, the symptoms, well, there are some target symptoms that Prozac's fantastic for. 70% chance they'll impact target symptoms. And the more you identify a target symptom, the more you're going to like your job. Whereas if you just leave it hanging, then I'm going to prescribe Prozac and you're going to come back 4 to 6 weeks and be happy, they're never going to think you're any good. Really important concept. So identifying an appropriate, and I think an appropriate target symptom in DMDD is first go after the safety stuff. Oh, they're putting holes in your wall once a month. Let's make that a target goal for the medication. Okay, you're getting calls from the principal 3 times a month. Let's try to get 50% less. Let's try and get that down to 1 or 2. I'm wrestling improvement. I'm wrestling what I expect medicines to do because families don't know. They want that risperidol to put their kids to bed and feed them. Okay? All right, I talk about the continuum of medication. Those are these 2 slides. And I tell them what I would do if it were my kid, but I give them some options. Okay, I scare them on purpose. Now I just scare them to death about risperidol. Okay, still prescribe risperidol. Okay, going the wrong way. I think we're 2 slides from the end. I summarized the criteria. It's too hard to remember 11, so I just kind of fudged and gave you hopefully a middle image of what DMD is. And if you really want to make it easier, I want you to remember the core criteria for DMDD. Can somebody name the first one? Tantrums. What's the second one? Persistent or chronic irritability. Okay? All right, let's go back to the test question. Children diagnosed with DMDD are less dysfunctional, have a better prognosis, have fewer hospitalizations than children with bipolar disorder. True or false? False. Okay? And by the way, even when they were arguing in the 2000s over this issue, everyone agreed that both subsets are incredibly dysfunctional and incredibly dangerous. Okay? I think that's it. All right, it is 11:41. Beat up on me. Ask me some questions. What can I do to help?
I don't want to beat up on you.
Yeah.
I just want to endorse what you said.
Okay.
Especially working in a community mental health setting.
Yeah.
Typically being care. And one of the things that we work really hard, I think, as a state is that screening for trauma, because trauma has been tried to
Michelle.
So, is this this mood dysregulation, or is this a child who's like coping in the best strategies they can with chronic, like you call it, chronic chaos? And I think that especially in kids, that screening for trauma as part of the assessment is just critical, especially in the community mental health.
Now with TennCare, 18 and under, we're required to do that screening. We actually can't get paid from TennCare unless we fill out a form. Now, hopefully we're doing more than just filling out a form, but couldn't agree with you more. I can give you a war story on that. I lived in Florida for 5 years, the biggest mistake of my life, and in Fort Lauderdale. And we had 5 hurricanes in 4 years. One of the hurricanes knocked out electricity for 6 weeks. Worse than that, we had no cable for 3 months. No internet for 3 months. And my kids, I think, missed 4 weeks of school. And none of my kids have ADHD. They eventually went back to school. When all those kids went back to school, what did they all have? ADHD. They were inattentive, hyperactive, and impulsive. Now, let's put some chemicals into this. Probably their norepinephrine and dopa was sky high. Okay? But you can only live with sky-high norepi and dopa for so long before you've exhausted it. ADHD is too little dopa and norepi. And so if you chronically traumatize a kid over and over and over, theoretically you could use up or make less norepi, and they could all end up looking like they have ADHD. But you have a completely different etiology. And ADHD never goes after etiology. Okay? And so I think there's good evidence. I think there's even some pretty good research to support what Michelle just said. Okay? If you would put one of my kids, when they went back to school, on Ritalin or Concerta or Vyvanse, they would have gotten worse because you would have been increasing norepi and dopa. Okay? But if you take a kid that's been for 5 years in chronic chaos and you put them on a stimulant, you're probably actually going to improve their behavior. Not their problems underneath, but improve their behavior. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I had 2 questions.
Yeah.
One was, you mentioned that there's some association of anosognosia with DMDD, and I didn't know that you knew any backdrop in terms of biological reasons for that.
I don't.
Okay, and the second question I had was, part of what I found with a lot of the child psych diagnoses is there is so much overlap. You've got conduct disorder, you've got ODD, you've got DMDD, bipolar, and I guess I worry that we give too many comorbid diagnoses, and I really appreciate your very practical presentation of how to try to work with this. But what's your take on the suggestion that there's so much possible comorbidity available that even DSM-V says in their book?
My view is that they're going to laugh at me 100 years from now. I mean, we're in the dark ages of child psychiatry. We have a DSM that's basically written for adults. You add in IQ, developmental, growing up in a family system, it's just incredibly chaotic. Right now I have a system where I can talk to other child psychiatrists and we can talk educated because I've got a system. That's the DSM-IV to the DSM-V. So there's some uses to it. Do I believe in it? Not at all. But it's what I have to work with. More importantly, it impacts my pocketbook. If I don't work within it, I don't get paid. And so I'm going to work within it. Let's see if I can be a little bit more philosophical about it. You know, the brain is developing. I guess that's what I would say. I mean, you're myelinating, you're demyelinating, you're getting rid of neurons and connections and synapses. And so to think that you're in a final diagnosis when you're going through all that is crazy. And so I'm asked to come up with a final diagnosis in a 7-year-old. If you think about that, that's ludicrous. It's really kind of ludicrous. So that would be my personal view. I don't know of any research that's going to go after your comment, but comorbidity is the rule, not the exception. Go ahead.
You also mentioned that you have to deal with chronic severe diagnosis of pain for. And I guess what I read was that we need to be trying to teach what is the way to kind of diagnose in a different area, DSM-V,
Yeah.
survival. But I think in many ways when you kind of go with what it takes for, are we kind of going down that slippery slope of then dealing with what the insurance company wants versus maybe what's actually best for the child and,
I think the answer is clearly yes. Absolutely yes. For good or for bad. Again, communication-wise, it's probably good. I've got to turn something in But how many V codes should have been the appropriate diagnosis, but I know I can't get paid for it, so I bump it, do it all the time, especially in private practice, where I was treating a pretty healthy population. Okay. So yes, I am a liar. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for an excellent review.
Thank you.
Not being a child psychiatrist, I've been confused for so long about bipolar sort of children. So to me, this seems like a real improvement. My question is, how is the field of child psychiatry as a whole reacting to this? Because I know it was very controversial
Yeah.
when DSM-V was being
Well,
debated.
none of us jumped into it. I don't think I gave a DMD diagnosis until 18 months after May 2013, so we were all very slow to do it. I think we were more concerned that all of a sudden insurance companies were going to stop letting you prescribe a drug for a new diagnosis because there's no research to support risperidol for DMDD. But that didn't happen. So once we found out it was safe to diagnose DMDD and I could still get the meds I want, we've kind of all endorsed it. So overall, child psychiatry is liking this. It's a little bit of clarity in a very muddy pond. Does that help? Okay. You know, just one example, Dr. Robertson in Knoxville, who I think is a wonderful child psychiatrist, he and I are on the opposite polar ends. Anything that moves and all that, he'll call bipolar, and I almost really didn't believe in it. And now we have some middle ground where we can say, that's more DMDD and that's more. And so the DSM-V has helped some there. And I really don't think John Robertson's wrong. I don't really think I'm completely right. It's just two views of muddy water. Yes, sir.
A comment, and then I'd like to share a vignette that I think goes to something you're talking about. The comment relates to your hypothetical question about is irritability a behavior or a mood? I think there's a third option, and that is it's a threshold.
Okay.
Just as another way to think about it.
Maybe fluff that out for the group when you say.
Well, so for example, kind of analogous to a seizure threshold. Okay? You don't see anything until you exceed the threshold, and then you've got an event. So you can have somebody whose threshold for responding to a frustrating stimulation or maybe just excessive sensory stimulation is lowered,
Okay.
and it gets expressed as irritability. The comment has to do with your approach in terms of documenting in frequency and intensity of outbursts, and also documenting family dysfunction. And I want to share a story about how those two are inseparable, because the information you get about outbursts will be filtered through the family dysfunction. Last year, Dr. Burrow and I worked together on a case of a juvenile homicide. The kid was in treatment at a mental health center, not yours, for quite a long period of time. And the mental health center never knew that this kid had a history of multiple episodes of strangling classmates. Okay. And the reason they never knew it is because the family's take on it was that their little angel was actually the victim. He was responding to the family's perception that he was bullied. That wasn't true. And the family dysfunction was such that they saw strangling as a proportionate response. So the family never told the mental health center about any of this because they didn't think it was violence. They thought the kid was just engaging in self-defense. And so the kid was never treated for this, and the treatment team never knew what was going on. And the point is that reports about what is violence, what is a tantrum, what is an outburst, are going to get filtered through what all this means to the family. And for families where violence is normative, you may get a very attenuated picture of what's actually going on. I think it puts a premium on collateral information. If the mental health center had had direct communication with the school about why it was that the kid was being homeschooled and wasn't enrolled in regular class, they would have discovered that the homeschooling started after the last episode of strangling a classmate.
Right. Here, I agree. The one red flag that will pop in my office that will alert me to that is when the parent bitterly complains that the teacher doesn't communicate with them. What that really means is the school has found when they communicate with them about all the violence that all they do is get attacked. The mother argues with them, the father, and all that. And so when I hear that, and I can't tell you how often I hear that, the school doesn't communicate with me about hitting it. And then I'll say, well, is he that way at home? Well, yeah, he hits me and smacks the kid and kills the cat and, and all that kind of stuff. Well, you don't know what's going on at school? Well, how about you communicate with the school? And so just one clinical pearl is if you've got a family that's really complaining about a wonderful teacher who doesn't communicate with them, dial in. And any information you can get from teachers is wonderful. The way we do that as case managers and teacher ADHD forums that invites comments, and I get them front and back. They're wonderful.
One other comment.
Yeah.
Goes to your safety plan.
Mhm.
In the particular case I'm talking about, the juvenile who was charged with a homicide had been given his first gun by his family at the age of 5. And who would even think to ask about a 5-year-old's access to firearms?
Here, here. All right, well, next time I'll have more candy bars. Yes, sir.
Any comment on your experience with guanfacine versus clonidine? Not to suggest that medication is necessarily the first route that we should be going, and I think more attention is going into
And
therapy.
I heard
psychotherapy
clonidine. What
to-
was the other drug?
Sorry?
Clonidine and
Guanfacine.
guanfacine. Okay, so they hit the same alpha-2, but clonidine is dirty. It hits all 4 subunits. Okay? And then you have to remember there's long-acting clonidine and short-acting clonidine, but I'm not going to complicate that. So clonidine is a more sedating, more possibly blood pressure lowering because it hits all four subunits of the alpha-2. 10X only hits 2 of the subunits. Okay? So it's a gentler, it's a more long-acting. The half-life of 10X is 8 hours. Clonidine, it's 4 to 6 hours. So a lot of us use 10X or Intuitive throughout the day, and then we switch to clonidine at night. Okay? Clonidine, IR, the short-acting, goes sky high in the blood system within 15 to 30 minutes, and that's what creates sleep. You're probably aware that the most prescribed medication for children by pediatricians for sleep is clonidine IR, short-acting. Whereas Capve, or clonidine ER, never gets a high blood level. It barely goes up, stays up for 12 hours, and comes down. And it'll never help with sleep. 2 very different drugs with the same generic drug in it. Let me see if I can go back to your question. So I like clonidine and 10X a lot for anxious, traumatized, irritable, angry, violent ADHD kids. That's where I use them the most. I use clonidine more when I need sedation and slowing, 10X when I need less of that. That go after your question? Okay. Used to be I couldn't get Capve and Intuitive paid for. Now there are generic forms. Sometimes I can get those paid for. I can always get clonidine and guanfacine or 10X paid for. I know I'm throwing a lot of words out there. That's another talk. Other questions or comments? All right, thank you. Oh, you don't want my badge.